Welcome to the Startup Competitors Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Kelly. You can learn more about us at startupcompetitors.com. Today on the podcast, we have Doug Collins from AppealTrack. Doug, welcome, man.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
All right. Tell us about AppealTrack.
AppealTrack is kind of a hybrid between a CRM and a workflow or property management system. I guess I kind of think of it as Basecamp for property tax. So in the property tax space, it's a niche industry. You've got these professionals, typically lawyers or property tax consultants. They represent typically the owners of commercial and industrial properties, and they basically contest with the various municipalities the value of the property. So if you've got $1 million property and you're in a 2% tax district, you're going to pay $20,000 a year in taxes, right? So these people fight on the behalf of the owner to say, hey, it's not worth $1 million, it's worth $500,000, and therefore they can get a reduction in property taxes. Very, very niche industry.
It's funny. I just sat down over the last couple of weeks. We sat down with Doxley and Tenant Tracker. So you're like Doxley meets Tenant Tracker because real estate. Legal.
Yeah, right. I get it.
So paint a picture of current status. Where are you guys today? How many employees? How many customers? You had some big news last year.
Right.
Talk through kind of where you guys are at now.
Right. So AppealTrack right now manages about 100,000 commercial and industrial properties throughout the country. We've got, pipelines for gas and oil that run through an entire state. We've got commercial office buildings in all the major metros, and then commercial and industrial properties throughout most of the U.S. There's well over $100 billion in value that's currently being managed on the platform. We've got, with respect to customers, we've got everything from boutique law firms to the fifth largest public accounting firm to Fortune 100 companies that are currently using the software. And sort of as you alluded to, the big news was last year in April, in fact, we were acquired by a competitor that's based in San Diego, California.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
All right. So think back to when you were starting or first getting started. And like when you were looking around in the market, how did you identify the opportunity? What competitors did you look at to say, well, clearly they're doing something wrong. We can do it better. Right. Help paint that picture for.
Yeah. So I've got a consulting background, and a friend of mine who's in this space basically came to me and said, hey, I feel like I'm serving IT. IT isn't serving me. Can you help? And I said, sure. So I started a project that I thought would become a software selection where I just understand the industry, understand requirements, go to the market, and basically identify a list of vendors, and through a competitive process, help him select the best vendor. And what I found was there was an absence of vendors in the market space, or rather the marketplace at that time. So I said, hey, you never want to build software. You always want to buy unless there's a clear and compelling reason to build. And I felt like we had one. So I built him a premise-based solution. A few months later, I went back and said, hey, is it okay if I go market this? And that's the point where I decided to sort of put my chips in the middle of the table, re-platform it to a cloud-based product, and form a company around the product. So in that time...
And how far along were you from there? So from the time that he showed up and said, hey, man, I could use some help, to you saying, wow, this is like a real company. I think this is worth doing.
Right. It was probably a 6-month period of time.
Okay.
Yeah. So the premise-based solution, that was pretty easy to build in a short amount of time. It had a meaningful impact to his work. It really moved the needle in terms of efficiency. Things that used to take him, 10 minutes per step, we're now taking a couple clicks of the mouse. Things that used to take a couple hours, we're now taking a couple minutes. And he was impressed by the results. So that's when I started to shake the bushes a little more and say, hey, I wonder if we could form a company around this.
Got it.
When I started down that path, there were actually a couple of competitors that surfaced. And they were big competitors. They were very well-funded companies. They were operating on a much larger scale. The product wasn't specifically aimed at what AppealTrack does, but there was enough overlap that they were certainly a legitimate competitor.
Okay.
And really that was somewhat disconcerting for me. I think that was probably the point where fear and doubt started to enter the picture for me.
So 6 months in, you decide to go after it, and it's at that time you identify the couple of competitors, and you're like, crap, like maybe this isn't what I thought it was.
Yeah. And to make matters worse, I was able to sign 2 contracts with 2 new customers. And one of those customers actually basically paid me a year in advance. So it was a very significant amount of money.
Right.
And I took that money plus personal savings and kind of pushed my chips into the middle of the table and said, okay, let's do this. So that had already taken place. The developers had already been hired.
Nice.
And now some of the competitive landscape starts to emerge. And it was like, oh, crap. Right.
All right. So I'll bite. How did you deal with that?
So the development firm that I hired right out of the gate, it became pretty clear very soon into the process that I had made a poor selection. So things weren't going the best on that front, right? The competitors start to emerge and all kinds of fear and doubt starts entering in my head. And I remember very clearly sitting on my couch with literally, this is like everybody talks about this scenario, but it was real. I was on my couch. I had the blankets over my head and I'm just like tears are running down my face. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what have I got myself into? So that was sort of the beginning of my journey of identifying and dealing with fear.
All right. What'd you do?
I started to read a lot. I started to talk to a lot of people. And the competitors that I identified right out of the gate, they're really huge, right? From my perspective, unlimited resources. And then I remember attending a TechPoint event here in town, and I heard somebody speak, and it was someone who worked at Lilly. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, never fear the big boys. Their size is their vulnerability. And that was meaningful to me because, at this point, it was just me. I could make quick decisions. We could pivot. We could change, we could modify a strategy. We could add features. We could do whatever we wanted to in a very short amount of time. And I realized that was really a strength of a small company. And it was certainly a weakness of larger companies. So I think that was sort of the first lesson that helped me start to manage and deal with fear.
What else?
With respect to fear, what else? What else?
Yeah. What else did you do that? Even other fears, right. Other ways you dealt with them.
Yeah. So other fears. Gosh, I've got a couple. So I had come out of management consulting, and I took a sort of a detour, a good one, but a detour nonetheless in the nonprofit sector for about 7 years. So I found myself in what were likely some of the highest earning potential years of my life, with a whole bunch of uncertainty on the horizon, right? And I think, so we may or may not get back to this, but I think that caused me to be a little bit more conservative in my approach than I should have been. A lot of times we see people who are raising way too much money out of the gate. They're hiring way too many people. They're going all in too soon. I think I sort of suffered from the opposite of that. I think I was on the other end of the spectrum.
Didn't raise enough money. Didn't hire enough people.
Yeah. Down the road. Yeah. Once we got traction, once there was market fit, I think that I should have raised a more meaningful amount of money so we could accelerate the growth. We could hire a bigger team. We could solve higher priority problems for our customers. I think we would have benefited from that. I think one of the other things was I was afraid of taking on investment capital. And there were people who wanted to invest, right? The only thing for me at that time that was scarier than losing my own money was losing somebody else's.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, obviously they know the risk, they know what they're doing, right? Like,
yeah, I know.
Where does that fear come from?
I don't. Maybe the fear of letting people down, the fear of looking less than capable, the fear of not having the abilities that I thought I might have. So and it was a friends and family round. We never went beyond the friends and family round, and
awkward Thanksgivings for the rest of your life.
That's right. So So at some point, here's where that table turned. I went into this thinking, hey, this is going to be a little side hustle for me. This is going to be something that'll put an extra $50,000 a year in my pocket. And I got introduced into this space, into the tech community. And the more I talked to people, even people who didn't know this industry and people who had achieved success, they looked at me with complete confidence and said, listen, this is not $50,000 a year. This is easily $50,000, $100,000 or more per month. And the first few times I heard that, I just didn't believe it, and I think that was the fear. And then over time, I started to actually believe what my friends were telling me. And I think that helped turn the tables. And then with respect to the investment capital, I think with a little bit of newfound or relocated confidence in myself, I thought I'm just as good of a bet as Wall Street. And I think that thought is really what said, okay, I'm ready to take on investment capital.
Are you as good a bet as Bitcoin?
I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait and see on that.
Right. By the time this comes out, Bitcoin could be worth like $2, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right, cool. So thanks for that. What, I guess in those early days, as you were going to market and trying to figure out kind of where you fit, how you position yourself against larger companies, what are some other things that were helpful while you were trying to figure that out?
Yeah, I think, that's a good question. There were several things. I think the first one is this whole concept of validation. And we see lots of companies and we hear lots of stories about people who went to market too quickly and they didn't ensure that there was good market fit for the product. So I think we did a lot of discovery with customers. We spent a lot of time understanding, what are you actually trying to accomplish? Like, don't talk to me about, I need this feature or that feature. Like, why do you need that? What's the impact of that feature? How does that affect your company? How does it affect you personally? What does it actually accomplish for you?
Did you was all of that validation done verbally by you while you were talking to prospects, or did you have other like automated ways of trying to figure out what the customer wanted?
We had limited automated ways, and I think that's something that we're still pressing into. And I think that we've made a lot of progress with respect to collecting that data automatically. At that time, it wasn't just me. I think it was everybody on the team who had this mindset of, let's understand the job that they're trying to accomplish. It's the Clay Christensen jobs to be done theory, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like,
right on.
What are you trying to accomplish and why? And we would get to, from a process perspective, a financial perspective, an emotional perspective, right? Like, how does it make you feel if that thing doesn't work the way you want it to work? And when you're talking about property taxes, we're talking about big dollars here, right? We're talking about multi-million-dollar buildings. So if they miss the ability, if they miss a deadline to file an appeal, they've just missed a huge revenue opportunity. And you can think about how that impacts people at various levels.
Right.
So I think the more that we try to get into their shoes and understand their world and even understand the language that they use, right? Like a lot of times we go out with products and we put the words that we think will be the bait or the hook for the prospect. But really, until you start understanding and using their language, I don't think you're there yet. So I'd say validation is probably one of the things that was most beneficial to us. And it's something we still do now, right? Like even as we're evaluating features, it's like, why? What is this feature going to accomplish for the customer? Is it going to make their life better? Is it going to make something they do every day easier? Like, let's evaluate, why is this important? What will the impact be? So it's something I think that we did pretty well early on, and it's something that continues now.
Got it. Once you identify like, okay, we're going to build this thing, we view it as a differentiator for us or our competitor, right? Like the person who's in the space, or maybe it's table stakes, right? Like they do it, we got to do it too.
Right.
What's next? So then from that point, when you guys identified those opportunities, and you did say earlier that the early development partner you chose was on the struggle bus a little bit.
Right.
Talk a little bit more about that. So when you went to actually start building some of this stuff, what happened?
Right. So when I understood that I had made a bad selection on the development partner, at that point, it was essentially, let's constrain the scope as much as possible. Let's get to MVP, but a true product, right? And let's get that shipped and out the door. And at that point, I had to quickly get back into the marketplace and find a vendor who was more suitable for the platform that we'd selected.
Did you outsource your development the entire time, or did you at one point have full-time?
At one point, we had full-time in-house development.
Okay. Was that right before you got acquired?
It was. Okay. Right.
Got it.
Right.
Sorry, I'm just curious about that. Keep going. Obviously, my day job. So in terms of, the interesting thing was when you look at the company that acquired us, you talk about table stakes and how do you figure out what you build, et cetera. Yeah.
Pound for pound, the company that acquired AppealTrack has a competitive product. It's targeted at a slightly different job to be done, and that's with personal property, not real property, right? Nonetheless, it does the job of tracking everything that a person would need to do for real property tax appeals, right? The thing that differentiated us was our focus on UI and UX. So they had a system that was on an older technology stack. And I think at the end of the day, their lack of involvement by skilled UI and UX designers was the thing that held them back and was the thing that gave us advantage in the marketplace. Even though there were lots of things their product could do that ours couldn't, that was the thing that differentiated us in the market. I mean, users, you have to pay attention to the user experience, right? And it's not like we've got this figured out. I mean, there's still a long way we have to go, but I think that the validation and then the attention and focus on UI and UX is really what got us differentiated in the market.
Yeah, it's interesting. It calls back to me something that Costas from Agent Legend, I think it was episode number 2 of the podcast. He talked about, because I had asked him once, like, how do you figure out what to put on the roadmap for what you're going to build next? And his answer to that, I might butcher this a little bit, was surprising to me, because he was like, no, most of the time we're trying to figure out what can we take out, right? Like, because we want to make the user experience better. We don't want things in there that, people said they wanted, but they don't actually end up using, right? Like, so anything that can distract from that kind of core user experience,
absolutely,
the real problem you're trying to solve.
That's right.
And so for him, it was like, no, we hear customers saying they want it, we'll build it, but then we're not done. Like, we're going to still validate, like, okay, we built it. Are you using it?
Right.
Is it
absolutely?
Actually,
well, and a couple of things about that. I mean, that was Steve Jobs' mantra, right? The magic is in what you leave out.
Right.
I think the other thing, what users say, I want this feature or that feature. It's the old Henry Ford quote, right? Which isn't actually attributable to Ford, but nonetheless, the quote's powerful. It says, hey, if I would have given the people what they wanted, it would have been faster horses.
Right.
So I think the thing I found is users are really good at articulating pain. They're not necessarily good at articulating solutions, right? So the better you understand the pain, the better you understand, again, the job to be done, what they're trying to accomplish, the better solution you can build for the user.
Got it. All right. So validation, better user experience. Anything else you did to differentiate, or anything else that helped with some of those early fears of trying to get over the hump and get a product out?
Yeah, I'd say one of the best things I probably did early on was putting together an advisory board. And it wasn't the token advisory board where you try to get people with big titles who have accomplished a lot so you can put them on the website, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, you didn't ask me, so obviously.
Right. So I didn't shoot high enough, right? But I picked some people who I've been through the trenches with, people who I worked with back in my management consulting days, people who are close enough with me and we have a trusting enough relationship that they can disagree, and they can disagree strongly when they need to. And people who I, again, just trusted and respected. I think that was one of the best things I did early on.
Did you, in thinking through the people that you asked, how much of that, maybe some random questions on that side, I'm just genuinely interested. Were any of those early people investors?
Yes.
And did that play a role in you asking them to be on the board, or would you have asked them anyway?
I would have asked them anyway.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Which makes sense in a friends and family round, right?
Yeah.
Like those same people are going to support you. But okay, then the next question would be, how much preference in the people you reached out to ask was given to like a complementary skill that they could bring, like to coach you on? So, right, like when I think of our tenant tracker board, we have somebody with a lot of experience in venture capital. We have somebody in a lot of experience in accounting and finance. We have somebody in a lot of real estate experience, right? Yeah. So like we've tried to think through where are we deficient and where could we use the advice? Right. But then we also really trust those people. We really, we also feel like they'll give us critical feedback if we need it. For you, what did that process look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was some of the same. I was looking for complementary skills. I was, again, looking for people who would tell me when I had it wrong, right? You don't want a board full of yes men and yes women, right? That's the group that you need to be able to turn to and say, I know I'm going to hear the truth. I know that I'm going to get advice I can trust. So I looked at people who had been successful in startups. I looked at people who are successful in the real estate industry. I had a CFO. I'm somewhat weak in finance, so I needed to have somebody with that bent on the team. A former partner from one of the big 5 consulting firms. So yeah, I wanted to look at a lot of different skills and perspectives, and And I even wanted to cultivate some disagreement among that group, honestly, because you need that sometimes, right? You need to hear different perspectives. You need to draw those different perspectives out so you feel like you've got enough information to make a good decision.
Can you give an example of, to whatever extent you can give an example, Can you give an example of maybe a time when you did get kind of some brutally honest feedback, maybe that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. So there was a point very early on in the formation of the company where I was considering outsourcing the lead generation. And the person that I got connected with, there were no issues, no concerns with this person. He had been very successful in that space and actually had a relationship with one of the members of the advisory board, right? So I'm pouring through his proposal. I'm running the numbers. The numbers are making sense. The numbers are going to bring clarity. And if it turns out that it's an unsuccessful endeavor, that means, hey, we probably need to sunset this thing sooner than later, or it's not going to be the 50, 100, 200K a month business that I've been told that it could be, right? So I walk into the board meeting and I've got this proposal and I lay it out and I talk about why I need to move forward and, with hiring this group, what the impact this is going to have to sales, the impact it's going to have to revenue, where it will put the company in terms of longer term trajectory. And I was really taken aback because pretty much in one voice, they're like, no, this is a horrible idea. And I'm like, what do you mean this is a horrible idea? And they said, listen, that you are in a longer sales cycle space. You are in a space where relationships matter. You cannot outsource these critical touch points to someone who's not part of the company. And they all said this. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this makes so much sense. And so I jettisoned the proposal. And it's funny because right before the board meeting, I'm in contact with this company. I'm like, hey, I've got a meeting with my board tonight. I think we'll be in touch tomorrow. We'll probably move this thing forward. Let's move forward with haste and vigor. And my phone call to him the next morning was, hey, I'm sorry, we're going in a completely different direction. And that was the beginning of the search for the first key employee.
Salesperson.
Yep.
Nice. That's a good story. I like that.
Yeah.
I think you've told me that one before, but I'd forgotten it. So it's a good story.
And there were other times too, right, where I go in with the perspective and what I think is the right thing. And sometimes you just can't see the forest for the trees. And you've got these other people who have a different vantage point, a different perspective. And they're like, no, you're too far down in the weeds on this. Let us pull you up.
Yeah, they're not in it.
So there were a lot of points where that happened, but that's the one that stands out the most. And they were right. It would have been a bad idea to outsource these touch points when oftentimes these conversations were the first of many that oftentimes, took 6 months or sometimes longer to close a deal.
You're still in the business today after post-acquisition.
That's right.
Still working with AppealTrack. When you look at the market today and you try to think of kind of your either niche in it or wedge into it against you still have other competitors. What are you guys doing right now from a strategy perspective to differentiate?
Well, I think the biggest thing we're doing right now, Mike, is we're going after a larger available market. So we've had great success with these attorneys and tax consultants who serve these large owners of the real estate, just any retail, lots of different, wholesalers, retailers, large commercial businesses in various industries. Now we're pivoting the product to actually go after the larger available market instead of going after all of the 10 or 15 attorneys that may serve a retailer. We're actually going after the retailer and saying, hey, we have a platform for you. Use this platform to track and manage your properties and assign them out to all 15 of your providers. We'll give you real-time information. We'll roll it up in real time so you can see how these vendors are performing. Are they engaged? Are they actually doing the work that you're expecting them to do? So it's a pivot in that we're going up the ladder, up the chain.
And is anybody else going up the chain?
Not really. So the company that acquired AppealTrack has a lot of these relationships already, right? That was one of the most compelling reasons to do the deal is if I did go out and raise more money, that doesn't necessarily buy relationships and it doesn't necessarily buy you a way in the door, right?
Right. And going back to the advice from your board, in this industry, relationships matter.
Relationships are everything. Yeah. So now that we've got the relationships, we're expanding the scope of the product to solve bigger and better problems. And so here we go. And we've got a couple of companies that are in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 that are engaged and on the hook, and expect to announce at least one of those here in the next couple of months.
Awesome, man.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
What else, as you think about kind of the roadmap going forward? So look 12 to 24 months in the future, if you think of AppealTrack and how you're setting that roadmap, what are some of the factors you're thinking through that are going to determine what roadmap?
I think for me, it's two things. It's how do you reduce churn and how do you increase revenue? And obviously tied to the churn piece is customer satisfaction, right? So I think being more and more attentive or continuing to be attentive to how does the customer engage with the product? What is their experience? How does the product make them feel? What other problems do they need to solve, but the product doesn't presently solve? And to the point we talked about earlier, you can't add everything, right? If you add everything, you end up with this product that's cumbersome and it's expensive. It's difficult to test. It's hard to train. And, ultimately customers don't use those products because they're too complex.
Right.
So that's where I'm looking, is reducing churn and increasing revenue. And of course, tied to that is how do we make the customers have an even better experience?
And is increasing revenue, again, just curious, you don't have to answer this, is increasing revenue just going after more sales? So landing more of those Fortune 100, retailers, manufacturers, whoever it is who own the buildings, or is increasing revenue specifically within product, adding new modules, upcharging? Like, is there a strategy tied to product around increasing revenue as well?
Yeah, I think the way I'd answer this in our present situation is it's twofold. Number one, it's increasing the number of customers. But number two, it's also going upstream, right, to these larger available markets.
Who could afford to pay more, maybe?
That's right. They've got bigger budgets. It's a bigger issue for them. If you're a property tax attorney and you serve 500 different customers and you've got a couple thousand properties, that's one thing. But if you're a national retailer and you've got 8,000 locations or 5,000 locations, and because of the way this industry works, they're not typically just giving this over to one company, right? They're picking 10, 15, in some cases 70 different providers to provide the service, because the people provide better results when they're geographically centric. They know the players in these municipalities. They talk to them on a weekly basis. They know how the local system works. Therefore, they get better results. So I think for these larger players, they need an integrated system that lets them engage as many providers as they want. And now I think the experience that we've gained, the lessons that we've learned, and now just looking at the data, it's like that's what the market really needs. And that's what we're going after very aggressively.
Right on. All right. People want to learn more about AppealTrack. If they want to be able to find you online, ask you questions, how do they do that?
They can go to AppealTrack.com. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm Doug S. Collins on Twitter.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.